SpaceX Dragon, we're go for launch. Let's light this candle.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
All right, liftoff, and the clock is started.
The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Atlantis.
Houston now controlling the flight of Atlantis. The space shuttle spreads its wings one final time for the start of a sentimental journey into history.
Houston, we've had a problem. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a brand new podcast series called Raptors and Dragons. And I'm here with Mason, and he's going to tell you what's going on today.
Yeah, of course, Jake. So today we're going to be covering Commercial Crew, Mars 2020, Delta IV Heavy, some Starship updates, upcoming launches, and much more.
So, headed over to Crew 2, they successfully launched from Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center around 5:50 a.m. Eastern on Friday, April 23rd, heading for the ISS and successfully docking 23 hours later. This being the second rotational mission of the Commercial Crew program. This crew aboard this rotation includes NASA astronauts Shane Kimbrough and Megan MacArthur, who is the spouse of Bob Behnken, who launched on Demo 2 in early 2020, riding the same Dragon capsule named Endeavour. Also on board was JAXA astronaut Aki Hoshide and ESA astronaut Thomas Pesquet. This being the first time in a very long time that there's been an astronaut from the US, Russia, Japan, and Europe all on station at the same time. This was the first crewed flight to use a flight-proven Dragon, Endeavour, as we mentioned with Demo 2, as well as a flight-proven booster, B-1061, which flew Crew 1 last November. This booster was successfully recovered on the Of Course I Still Love You drone ship, which was stationed in the Atlantic Ocean, and this booster is currently docked in Port Canaveral being processed. Crew 1 is expected to undock Friday, April 30th around 5:55 p.m. Eastern and targeted splashdown off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico the following day at 11:36 a.m. Eastern. Crew Dragon Resilience carrying Crew 1 astronauts Mike Hopkins, Victor Glover, Shannon Walker, and JAXA astronaut Suichi Noguchi. Now headed to Mason with some exciting Mars news to cover.
The Ingenuity Mars helicopter taking its third flight this week, rising up to a height of 5 meters, going downrange 50 meters, reaching a top speed of 6.6 feet per second, or 2 meters per second for all those on the metric system, and then returning back to its takeoff location. This was flight 3 of 5, and while we don't know the goals for the next two flights, we're sure that they will definitely be pushing the helicopter further, higher, and faster. But with the deadline for these flights quickly sneaking up, NASA will certainly make these in the coming weeks. Moving on to ULA news, we had a Delta IV Heavy launch on Monday, April 26, and launching the NROL-82 mission. This launch took place at 4:47 p.m. Eastern Time from Space Launch Complex 6 at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. Being a south launch, the payload was put into a polar orbit, with NROL Mission 82 being launched for the National Reconnaissance Office as well as the U.S. Space Force. The launch weather forecast is looking very unfavorable going to the launch, with a 40% chance of acceptable takeoff conditions, with the winds being the main primary air concern. Now, some interesting facts provided by ULA for this launch. This was the 143rd mission for ULA, the 90th of its missions to support national security, the 31st mission by ULA to support the National Reconnaissance Office, the 386th launch of a Delta-designated rocket since 1960, the 13th Delta IV Heavy launch, and the 9th Delta IV Heavy launch for the NRO. Now, moving on, we're going to talk about upcoming news and launches. Back to you, Jake.
Alright, thank you, Mason. Next up, we got Starlink Launch 24 set to launch from Space Launch Complex 40, located at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Targeting Wednesday at 11:44 p.m. Eastern with an instantaneous launch window. Instantaneously basically means that if we were to go into a hold or the launch would become a no-go, that they would have to scrub and look for a later date. The weather is currently 80% favorable, with the main concern being liftoff winds. This mission will be carrying 60 Starlink satellites and will be headed to low Earth orbit. The booster supporting the mission will be B-1060, having supported GPS-3, 4 Starlink launches, and Turksat 5A. This is supposed to be recovered on the Just Read the Instructions drone ship, which is going to be stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, let's hand it back to Mason with Long March 5B and some important NASA news.
On international space news, China is rolling out their Long March 5B rocket to launch the first module of its new space station, the Tianhe space station. This will be the core module and will be supported further in the future by additional modules. This comes at a time where China is working heavily to advance their space program independently from the international efforts that go into the ISS since their ban in 2012. With every presidential administration comes a new NASA administrator, and this one's no different. Currently, Bill Nelson is being considered as the next NASA administrator. Currently, he's seeing strong support during his nomination process in the Senate, but so far has few plans for how he would lead the administration, other than holding on to the previous goals like boots to the moon by 2024. And now back to Jake for some news on Starbase and Boca Chica.
Hey, thank you, Mason. So we have a lot of Starship news to cover. So starting off, Starbase has been very quiet since the cryogenic proof test of SN15, which was on April 13th. But this idle period broke silence yesterday with a pre-launch static fire. In other Starbase news, a rollout of a second ground support tank for the orbital launch site occurred earlier this week, with a third tank under construction. As of what we heard in last March, SpaceX hopes to make their first orbital test in July of this year. If they want to make this happen, they need to stick to a pretty tight schedule when it comes to Super Heavy and orbital pad building. It also appears that there is a nose cone on a test stand in the suborbital launch area. With Super Heavy Booster 1 on the way to the scrapyard, BN2 and 3 are taking shape in the manufacturing area. SN15 has had a giant makeover with some upgraded Raptors, thrust puck, and a header tank. As previously mentioned, SN15 resumed testing Monday, April 26th with a triple engine static fire using the brand new upgraded Raptors and the main tanks to verify the vehicle is ready for a 10-kilometer test flight, as well as a second static fire test on April 27th using the header tanks to test them ahead of the upcoming flight, which is scheduled for later this week. With no hard launch date scheduled, Starbase needs to start ramping up production since they've been selected for the Lunar Lander program for NASA's Artemis program. During this idle period, SpaceX has been working heavily on the orbital launch area for Super Heavy. Moving right along, SN16 is currently in 2 segments in the mid-bay and has currently received a nose cone, but has not yet been stacked. Now, back over to Mason with some more important news.
In other SpaceX news, SpaceX plans to ramp up their Vandenberg launch cadence with some polar orbit Starlink missions to lift off later in this year, estimating currently around July. Falcon Heavy also to see some action in July with U.S. Space Force 44 mission, which will utilize both drone ships. Elon has tweeted recently that there will be a third drone ship in the works, and that we can expect to see its debut during this launch, with the current name being hinted at a sudden fall of gravitas. In other NASA 2020 news, the MOXIE experiment, which stands for Mars Oxygen Insight Resource Utilization Experiment, has successfully created oxygen out of the carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere of Mars. Mars' atmosphere being 96% carbon dioxide. MOXIE works by separating oxygen atoms from carbon dioxide molecules, which are made up of 1 carbon and 2 oxygen atoms. The waste product of carbon monoxide is emitted into the Martian atmosphere. Now this process requires a lot of heat, up to 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit. So to accommodate this, the MOXIE unit is made of heat-tolerant materials, which include 3D printed nickel alloy parts, lightweight aerogel, and a thin gold coating on the outside of MOXIE, which reflects infrared heat. In further NASA news, the SLS core stage has arrived at the Kennedy Space Center for its final checkouts before the Artemis 1 mission, which will be an uncrewed mission around the moon. After winning the nearly $3 billion NASA Human Landing System contract to build the manned element for the Artemis program, Jeff Bezos of Blue Origin has filed a protest against NASA's decision. Now, finally back to Jake for some closing remarks about Starlink.
So, to close out the episode today, we have some important Starlink news. The Federal Communications Commission approved SpaceX's proposed modification of its Starlink license on Tuesday, a win for Elon Musk and his growing satellite internet network. SpaceX filed this modification request a year ago, asking to move the upcoming satellites to an altitude of 550 kilometers. Opponents filed numerous responses to SpaceX's proposed modification, with companies including Amazon saying it would cause interference with other satellite networks. Now back to Mason with some closing remarks.
And that wraps up our first episode. We really hope you've enjoyed. We look forward to continuing to be your source of breaking space news. With that being said, if you have any suggestions for us, we'd love to hear from you as we continue to learn and grow in this new space. And until next time, from our home to yours, we gotta go for launch. See you next time.